Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Tuesday Show as part of Amazing Advent. My name's Nathan, and today we are going to be, of course, digging into the Lord of the Rings. And with me, I am delighted to have two very special and knowledgeable men to accompany me on this quest. We are going to be looking at the film adaptations of the Lord of the Rings. The Peter Jackson ones from 2001 to 2003. I thought it was a particularly appropriate topic because we've just had the Rings of Power, dare I say its name, which I think everybody across the board has largely said was a terrible adaptation of the source material. But that got me to thinking, the original films are very much loved, but are they actually good adaptations or not? And so, as I say, I've got two fine gentlemen to help me. First, I want to introduce somebody who's making their debut on the channel, Black Horse. Welcome, Black Horse.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you. And could you just say a few things about who you are and what you do on kind of Twitter and YouTube for those who might not know you?
Yeah, so I'm a Canadian. I've been working with Lambda on his Bible studies channel for quite some time, so you'll find some of my work there. More recently, I've done a fair bit of work with Radical Liberation on his channel. In my professional life, I am pretty deeply involved in the financial industry, and so on his current event show, we cover a lot of sort of financial market stories. So we do that every 2 weeks, and you can follow my Twitter account and watch my prophetic condemnation of the Canadian government, from now until forever.
It's always beautiful to see. And am I right in saying you broke 1,000 followers on Twitter now?
Yeah, fairly recently. So that was, I've never actually wanted to have a large Twitter footprint. From the time I started using it, I wanted a particular group of people as Twitter followers. And I've now, all of my original targets are now following me on Twitter. So I feel as though I've accomplished my mission. So
that's awesome. That's awesome. And my other guest, well, he is a man of many names. Let's see if he can reveal his here.
Now, say my name.
Apostolic Majesty.
You're goddamn right.
Oh yes, smoke rises from the mountain of doom, the hour grows late, and Gandalf the Grey rides to Isengard, seeking my counsel. For that is why you have come, is it not, my old friend?
Saruman.
Saruman of many colours, of many names.
Oh, indeed, indeed. That's one thing the film could have done with a nice rainbow coat, right? But
that would have certain modern implications.
How are you doing, Apostolic Majesty?
I am doing fine. Thank you very much for having me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure as always. And is there anything that you would like to shill before we get going? I saw you had a recent stream on your channel. Was it just yesterday?
Oh yes, well, I stream every Monday, but other than that, no, nothing to shill. Just happy to be on to discuss this.
Black Horse, anything you would like to shill?
I think the recent stream that Radlib and I did on the SBF fraud situation this week or last week was pretty good. So go and check it out.
Definitely. And I would also recommend, you did a stream with Luke on Lambda Bible Studies very recently. And I can't remember the topic, but I remember thinking it was absolutely fantastic. So everybody should check that out. And for viewers of this channel, please like and subscribe. It makes a difference. And if you want to have your input into this conversation, please feel free to send a super chat. So before we get into the meat and bones of this topic, I'd like to ask both my guests if they would give a very brief summary of where they sit on where, how good these adaptations are. And I'll go with Apostolic Majesty first. What's your thoughts on this, on these films?
Well, I hesitate to say that they are the best adaptations possible, given the limitations of the medium, but also saying that implies a lack of imagination on my part to be able to conceive of something better. But from my end, they are the closest things to the best possible adaptations of the source material, which may be a very controversial opinion, especially given how much time you and I have dedicated to going over the source material of all specters of Tolkien. So yes, that's my overall impression of the films.
And Black Horse.
So I would have agreed with AM when I first saw the films as a teenager. Years of reflection has caused me to sour on them. I now view them as as quite marginal adaptations. And to contextualize that, I have to sort of indicate what I think is important in the adaptation of a work like Tolkien's work to the format of film. And I would argue that the most important element of a film adaptation of any source material is the successful communication of the themes the author intended to communicate across broadly the same set of devices the author intended to use to communicate them. In the context of the film adaptations of The Lord of the Rings, I would argue that the adapter really struggled to communicate a particular set of themes that I think are very important through the devices of narrative and plot, or of narrative and character. So I would really point to kind of three broad thematic areas where I think the film adaptations really struggle to communicate the themes Tolkien intended to communicate. The first theme would be that throughout the book, there's tremendous emphasis on every race or group of people within the narrative contributing to the struggle against evil according to their own means and in their own sort of little backyard. And I think a lot of the narrative omissions undermine this theme. And instead, you see a story about a group of heroes instead of a story of every group within Middle Earth contributing to the struggle according in kind of their own way and their own means. The next two themes are themes that are defined by the racial groups of the characters that exhibit them. The first is the theme. My view is that the theme for the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings story itself is a theme of, one of the themes that they convey is that of irrevocable sacrifice. And I think that the narrative omissions and the omissions in character development in the films really damage the communication of that theme. It very much transforms the story into a there and back again story, which is not the story the author intended to tell. And the last kind of area is when examining the race of men, both in the Lord of the Rings, but even in the broader setting, Tolkien elucidates this theme of the struggle to trust in divine providence rather than trust in one's own strength in order to accomplish the good that is laid forth in destiny. And again, I would argue that there's reasons why the choices made in the film adaptation undermine that theme as communicated by the source material.
Thank you. So just for my own position, I guess I'm maybe in between you two. I think they're good. First and foremost, they're good films, and I think they capture much of the imaginative brilliance of the Lord of the Rings in terms of the world and the aesthetic of it, and they're good adventure movies. And in that respect, then they capture, I think, a simplified version of the main themes, but there's some elements which I think they depart from in subtle but significant ways, which I think are make them maybe a 2D version of a 3D story. That's how I would see it. But I think nonetheless that they're still very good. And I would particularly say as well that I'm also glad as a kind of preface to this broader discussion. I'm glad they were made when they were and not 10 years later.
Yeah.
Right, because they're totally as far as I can see, they're largely untouched by the issues that films face today of kind of social justice and so on. They're not. There's nothing too explicit at this point. There may be one or two things we could get into,
But they're not
but
untouched by Hollywood's desire to insert modern romance.
that's true. That's true. But I don't think
I
it's
think
kind
I'll
of
push.
bashing you over
I
the
think
head.
I'll push back a little bit against that when we get to that. It's not quite Tariel in The Hobbit, is it?
No.
Yeah.
That's true. But okay, so before we get into it, you've already touched on this Black Horse, but we kind of need to discuss what makes a good film adaptation. We can't really evaluate whether this is good if we don't have some kind of criteria or principles in play. And you've already mentioned, how does the film reflect the themes of the book in regard using the same sorts of instruments. Do you see? Could you give a little bit more detail as to what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I would say that the challenge of adapting a book to the film format is to communicate the same kinds of themes that belong to the book properly through similar kinds of devices. So if you look at the devices that are used to communicate themes in Lord of the Rings, you can kind of see character devices, you see narrative devices, and unusually for writing, you see these really large aesthetic devices that are elements of the setting that are used to communicate themes. And so when you evaluate the communication of the when you evaluate the adaptation, there are a couple of things you have to decide. Well, what are the important themes that need to be communicated? What devices were used in the book to communicate these themes? What devices were used in the film to communicate these themes? Were these themes successfully communicated in the film? Were the devices comparable? And if they're not comparable, are they equally effective, or has the author's thematic vision been damaged in the transition?
AM, do you want to add anything on this question?
Well, I do quite a few film reviews on my channel. However, I'm doing it from a different standpoint. I'm doing it from real life to fictional adaptations in the form of historical adaptations. So this is new for me in terms of reviewing something on the basis of a fictional adaptation into a different medium, which is the Lord of the Rings as literature into the Lord of the Rings as films. But I would fundamentally agree with everything Black Horse has said. I'll probably change the wording a little bit and say, talk about the fundamental spirit of the books, what they're trying to get across, which is essentially the same as what Black Horse is iterating. But also, I would say, above all the things in terms of the priority or the pyramid of things you need to include in adaptation, I would say thematic elements, the fidelity to the plot, and the consistency of the characters. In terms of other elements, such as, the aesthetics or the mood and the setting, I feel that the literary genre gives license to the reader to enlist a huge amount of sort of qualifiers and imaginative devices to bring his own sort of imagination, or his or her imagination and world and viewpoint into the story. And of course, we don't have that really with film adaptation. With a film adaptation, you can say in many ways it is principally a visual medium. And so we are communicating these ideas through aesthetics, through music. And in this case, I would say this is another strength of the films, in the sense that I would argue that they are quite Wagnerian in their broad scope, as an attempt to meld visuals, acting, and music together with the core story of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I think the strongest positive argument for the adaptation is that the aesthetic elements that are specified in the source material, and the aesthetic elements that are more narrowly specified in the films are closer together than any other elements than any other elements. I would say that I probably have more tolerance than AM has for lack of fidelity to the specific plot or the specific characters in an adaptation, and more sensitivity to thematic unity, just in terms of the relative weight of what's important to me in an adaptation. And I think that's just a judgment.
And this is it's an interesting point, though, in terms of thematic fidelity and strict fidelity to the narrative, as in scene by scene recreation. What are we doing when we're creating an adaptation? Is it a reimagining of the story, or is it a literal recreation in terms of dialogue by dialogue, line by line, description by description? We're trying to create an exact recreation, or are we trying to imagine it as something else? In the case of Lord of the Rings, the issue is that the Lord of the Rings books are incredibly dense books. And you mentioned earlier this idea, Nathan, of a 2D adaptation. What I would say, when you're trying to condense all of this story and make it into, I don't know how long the theatrical versions are, but say the extended versions, about a 10-hour series, as opposed to, the 70 hours or so of actually sort of reading the books, or, listening to the books, an audiobook, etc., then one has to pick the scenes which are essential to the fundamental themes of the book, and one has to edit, one has to cut down and remove certain elements, and therefore the success of the adaptation lies in how does one streamline this, and how does one pick which elements are more essential to the plot and communicating certain ideas, and thereby inevitably, in a process of streamlining, various elements are lost. And then of course we have the even greater issue, which is not just editing things down, but changing the plot in itself. And this is also the case with
as
the
you edit
adaptations.
things down, inevitably you're going to have to change the plot in order to.
Well, not necessarily, because again, it depends on the actual sort of the actual quality of the creation to begin with. I feel that there's very little fluff in the Lord of the Rings books, and there isn't really that much fluff in terms of the Lord of the Rings films. But nevertheless, there are changes within the films, significant changes, which can't simply be put down to narrative streamlining or getting rid of certain scenes, etc. But yes, I think that's fundamentally how I would position the way to rate this adaptation.
Yeah, and I would argue that one of the weaknesses of this adaptation is that it is indulgent, particularly in the second and third movie, in the battle scenes, which attacks its ability to be faithful in other ways.
Oh, I'd agree with you completely. My favorite film, just for reference, is the first film, The Fellowship of the Ring.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think there's any argument for any other film being the best of them.
See, this is maybe where I disagree with both of you, actually, because in terms of an adaptation, I fully agree with everything you've both said, but I think first and foremost, as a film, it needs to stand on its own 2 feet and be a film that works, even if it departs slightly as an adaptation.
Yes.
Even if it's not the perfect adaptation. If it's
But
a
I
good
think,
film,
but I think
let me just finish my point for a second, because for me, The Two Towers is the most complete film of the 3, but it's not necessarily the best adaptation of the 3. So I would say The Fellowship's the best adaptation, but I think The Two Towers as a film works better in terms of its kind of completeness.
You might be right. Having put that forward, you might be right. I've always hated The Two Towers by far the most, because it's like this weird battle film, right? Something like 70% of the runtime is the Battle of Helm's Deep, in one part or another. But anyways, we should probably go about this in a more systematic way. So, given that we've identified that the fundamental thing that an adaptation is supposed to do is to communicate the themes and plot that the themes, plot, and characters that the literary source material communicates. Let's talk about some of the themes, plot, and characters that we think are communicated, and why we think they're good, why we think they're bad.
Well, do you want to pick one of those areas, Black Horse, to get us going?
Sure. So I would begin with the theme that with what I think is a kind of a deep theme in the book, the theme of the irrevocable sacrifice. So, and I'll begin by outlining why I think this is a theme in the book, where I think the theme is present in the book, and then we'll talk about how this theme is kind of communicated in the film adaptations, and then we can go from there. So, if I look at the characters that are followed consistently through the book, you begin with Frodo and Sam. You pick up a number of other characters along the way, but the very first thing that you see in the book is this. You see first Frodo himself deciding that he has to leave his life in the Shire in order to accomplish this kind of divine calling that he's brought to destroy the ring, or to at first just get the ring out of Sauron's hands. And so he, along with Gandalf, makes a decision that he's going to leave the Shire with no clear plans to return. So first, he makes this commitment that he's going to make this sacrifice on behalf of the good of mankind, to give up the life that he had with no clear plan that he shall ever return to it. The second pickup of this theme you see is when you see Sam, Merry and Pippin, and Fedgar Bulger, I think it is, who conspire to make sure that they're able to join Frodo in his exile, with no clear idea that they should ever be able to return, and no clear idea exactly why they have to make this sacrifice. They're making it for the sake of friendship rather than for the sake of any particular notion as to why it might be necessary. And you see this repeated over and over again. At the Council of Elrond, Elrond wants to send Merry and Pippin in the book back to the Shire in hopes of defending it, so that the thing that they leave behind that they're trying to protect might be better protected from the series of troubles to come. They choose not to. They choose to continue on. And on, more and more characters participate in this theme where they choose irrevocably to sacrifice the things that they apparently might value the most in favor of this kind of mission. And I think omitting things like the conspiracy among the hobbits, omitting the scouring of the Shire, which is the consequence of Merry and Pippin's decision not to return, omitting the choice for Merry and Pippin to return, omitting the withering of Lothlorien as a consequence of the elves' decision to destroy the ring. These are really fundamental omissions that were not necessary in the film adaptation, or not necessitated by the medium of the film adaptation, that undermine this, what I would say is an abiding theme that continues through all of the books.
Could I recontextualize this slightly?
Yeah, go for it.
I feel that all of these themes, as regards the adaptation in the film, are subordinate to the overriding theme, which is the power of the ring and the corruptive powers of the ring, but also the implications of destroying the ring, which of course reinforces the idea of the ultimate sacrifice in the case of not just Frodo, but all the characters in various different ways. In regards to that particular point you brought up about the fate of Lothlorien, it is briefly hinted in one line where Galadriel, after having interacted with the ring, passing the test, rejecting the ring, says, I
Says
shall
she'll be
diminish
diminished.
and I will pass into the west. So it's not an omission, however, it is definitely a streamlining of this fact. But again, it's because the focus ultimately is on the fellowship and on the journey of these characters. And for that sense, Galadriel is important in terms of aiding the fellowship on that mission. But in terms of Galadriel's particular fate, everything is sort of focused on that particular sort of through line in terms of focusing on these particular characters. Regarding the conspiracy of the hobbits, you're completely right in terms of getting rid of the Sackville Baggins plot, getting rid of changing the deed of the ownership of Bag End, Frodo moving out, etc. All of this stuff would have to be included if you were going to include the scouring of the Shire at the end, and so therefore removing one predicates the loss of the other. However, there's also that scene coming back to Lothlorien where Galadriel and Frodo look into the mirror, and we see what would have been ultimately the scouring of the Shire had it come to pass. And so the emphasis, therefore, is on the centrality of the mission to destroy the ring in terms of preventing that outcome. And it's almost the same logic that comes back to getting rid of Tom Bombadil at the same time, where the central focus is on the mission, the central focus is on destroying the ring, thereby having Tom Bombadil, who was a primordial force who was older than the ring, older than Sauron, and thereby is not ultimately susceptible to the ring's power, takes away from that central idea of destroying the ring and the focus of the Lord of the Rings. So in this sense, I believe that unfortunately, it's unfortunate. Say, for example, Nathan and I love the Scouring of the Shire. It's one of our favorite chapters in the whole Lord of the Rings series.
Right,
but in terms of focusing this, I can understand. I can't necessarily defend it, but I can understand why this was lost in order to prioritize the themes over a literal adaptation.
Right, but the question is, why is the Scouring of the Shire important to the book? Why is it important that when Sam, Frodo, Pippin, and Merry return to the Shire, it is not as they left it, right? It was not a there and back again story. They didn't return to an undamaged home. And they knew in their choices along the way that they chose to sacrifice an undamaged home for the sake of continuing on the journey, right?
Oh, I agree with you. And also notice my avatar for this evening, which is the character of Saruman. Nothing suffers more from this than not only you can say the final sort of demonstration of the development of the four hobbits, but also the aftermath of Saruman. In the extended version, Saruman and the entire sort of scouring of the Shire, the betrayal of Grimmer Wormtongue, etc., combined with the scene in the Two Towers, is combined into this scene, which results in, you could say, the rather anticlimactic death scene of Christopher Lee's Saruman.
Yeah.
But in the theatrical version, it's not even included. So definitely in terms of, this is why I believe focusing on the Scouring of the Shire is the most controversial element, because it not only affects the character assessment of the hobbits, the character of Saruman, also undermining the themes, of course, in terms of the ultimate corrupting power of evil, because Saruman is diminishing throughout the entire phase of the film. And of course, the Scouring of the Shire, I think Nathan and I discussed it in terms of the patheticness of evil, the vindictiveness, and how the character has declined throughout the stories. This isn't really illustrated in the film, but I will completely agree with you that this is the most controversial element for me. But I can understand why they did it within this idea of streamlining the films and focusing on the ring as the primary antagonist, and by extension Sauron. And as a result of that, Saruman suffers in some ways, but he also benefits from the adaptation in others, in the sense that Saruman gets significantly more screen time in the films than he does in the books. And ironically, the only scene where Saruman actually appears to the characters in real time, as opposed to in a flashback in the books, is cut out of the theatrical version of Return of the King.
Yeah, that's very interesting to me. It was a huge surprise to me when I watched the Two Towers movies to see no Sauron at the end of them.
No, I agree, and I think I mean, if I was to take a little bit more of a cynical point of view, I think the Scouring of the Shire is probably the most explicitly might be the wrong word, but it's definitely the most right-wing part of the Lord of the Rings, in the sense that it's where it comes home. So this lovely community, I guess it's anarchic in some respects, but it's communitarian in others. Industrialization ravages it. We have rationalized socialist sorts of laws being put into place.
Mm,
Um, it's um, it's all of the bad things are framed as being against this kind of conservative vision that Tolkien has in the Scouring of the Shire. Everything else, it's often the big wide world, it's a fantasy reality. But here you're getting rural England essentially destroyed.
Well, the other thing
And
that I
I do
think is
wonder if that's something that Jackson and co would not
and
have
again,
been
in
happy
terms,
with.
I agree with you, and I think in terms of them trying to get around this and trying to communicate the themes imperfectly within the films, instead, that theme of the destruction of the idyllic English countryside is transitioned away from the Shire into Rohan, and in particular, the destruction of the villages we see at the beginning of the Two Towers. But of course, it's definitely an imperfect attempt to rebalance the loss of the Scouring of the Shire.
Well, the other thing I think that's fascinating about the Scouring of the Shire is there's an implication when Gandalf refuses to return to the Shire with Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, that there's a sort of responsibility. There's a fortifying element to the quest, and and part of that fortification was intended that the hobbits be able to deal with this problem themselves, right? Uh, Part of what I would identify as a broader theme in Lord of the Rings, that each race and group of characters has a set of problems that is entrusted to them by Providence for them to overcome, right? One of the other things that I think is a failing of the adaptation is the choice not to explain the story of how Gimli comes to the Council of Elrond, or the troubles of the dwarves, and to what I would say is radically center the war between Gondor and Mordor uh, in what in the book is a much broader conflict in which every good character, every good group of
Indeed. And I think that that's why the Hobbit films in many ways were made, in an attempt to redress this issue and try and broaden the scope of the Lord of the Rings beyond that narrow track between the Shire to Osgiliath, Ithilien, Minas Morgul, and ultimately to Barad-dûr and the Mountain of Doom. But again, in terms of the limitations of the adaptation, we do communicate the pitiful plight of the dwarves through the passage into Moria and the fate of Balin in particular. And even though we don't have dwarves in the film, we only have, I think, a couple of cameos of the Council of Elrond. And apart from that, Gimli is the only mainstay of the dwarves and represents that. But again, I feel that the passage through Moria, which is one of the best parts in all of the films, is able to communicate that sense of desolation, and also it's a foreboding in terms of this will happen to all of the civilizations who have amalgamated into this alliance as per the Council of Elrond. And again, you could almost say that in terms of trying to think of an adaptation, as this is reinforced with Lothlorien, the diminishing of Lothlorien and the site of the Scouring of the Shire, you can probably, again, in terms of Peter Jackson trying to rationalize this is all hinting at the potential fate of the Shire should the quest fail. But again, from that point of view, it also lends to the view that therefore destroying it after the destruction of the ring would seem to defeat the entire purpose of that thematic element going forward. But you brought up a point earlier. I just want to bring it up because I'll forget it otherwise, which is the idea of the sacrifice and the idea of the characters making these decisions and deciding to give up everything. The specific element regarding the defense of the Shire is, of course, completely omitted from the film. But I feel in terms of Frodo in particular, it is a matter of pacing and it's a matter of developing these characters throughout the film. Whereas in the books, a lot of character development happens in the first book. And I would actually push back and say, therefore, that the strict adaptation to film Fellowship of the Ring suffers as a result of this. But in terms of the overall development of the characters, it's quite interesting because Frodo doesn't quite understand in the films what he is doing when he is traveling over to Bree and ultimately over to Rivendell.
That's right. They
to
get
carry the
swept
ring.
up. They get
They
swept up instead of making a calculated decision.
Yes, it is not a decision that the characters make. Rather, they are going off the advice of Gandalf, and they're expecting Gandalf to save them. And obviously, that is the tension. We know that Gandalf isn't going to rescue them. In many ways, you can say the first half of the Fellowship of the Ring is a horror film in terms of them really understanding the gravity of the situation they're in, especially in terms because Jackson's background is in horror, of course.
Yeah, no, it very much reads like a horror film until Rivendell.
Yeah. In terms of the editing, in terms of the Nazgul, say for example, coming into the Inn of the Prancing Pony and stabbing the beds repeatedly in the edits between Sam sleeping, etc. All of these things are really there to indicate horror, as with the Nazgul approaching Weathertop and attacking the hobbits on either side. But also, again, this is important in terms of introducing Aragorn. So when we finally come to the Council of Elrond, rather than Frodo making a premeditated decision to leave the Shire and give up Bag End, as was shown in the books, here this decision isn't omitted from the films. Rather, it is waylaid until we get to Elrond, where the Council of Elrond marks a decision where he is going to embark on this quest with full knowledge of the implications. And of course, the idea is reinforced when he visits Galadriel. And we have the idea that it's reinforced also in flashbacks in Two Towers, where the ring bearer knows that the quest will claim his life, etc., etc.
Well, but in the film adaptation, Gandalf knows the quest will claim his life. But does Frodo actually know that? Where do we find out that Frodo knows that? I don't think we do.
I think there's a moment in The Return of the King where Sam kind of mentions, we need to keep our stores in check for the journey back, and Frodo kind of suggests,
that's
is
true.
There going to be a journey back? So
in Return of the King, it is when they're crossing Mordor, it's clear that.
But there are other suggestions. I mean, there is a fatalistic element at Amon Hen when he decides to break away from Aragorn and depart from Mordor alone. And there is also, I think, a statement saying, we may never see them again, etc., referring to the other characters. And it's not just foreboding for those characters, but it's also foreboding for them as well. So there is an element where they are inviting doom with their decision, this inevitable doom. So I think it is communicated sufficiently throughout the films to get that point across. It certainly occurred that way for me.
I think definitely at Amon Hen, that's where Frodo really makes his decision in the films, because even the Council of Elrond, if you remember the scene, everybody's arguing and Frodo's in kind of pain watching all of this, and it's almost like just to be relieved of the pain.
Well, not only that, if you look at the scene in the film adaptation, the ring calls to Frodo, right? There's a heavy implication there that he makes the decision to take up the quest because he can't let go of the ring, right? It's a very, very different decision than the decision that's made by Frodo in the books, and very different thematically.
But again, that's the sort of the implication here, is that Frodo doesn't understand what he's embarking on in the films. And then, of course, it's even illustrated with Bilbo in terms of Bilbo's transformation at Elrond, the fact that he can't let go of the ring. So yes, I completely agree that there is an element communicated in the films that he's not doing this because of any predetermined desire to destroy the ring, but because, like Bilbo, he's beginning to be corrupted by the ring. But again, that's sort of demonstrates sort of good adaptation in terms of this character development takes place across the entire film. I mean, Aragorn is another good example. In the books, Anduil is forged from the shards of Narsil as they're there in Rivendell. There isn't this dramatic moment later on in the third film where Elrond presents Aragorn and Anduil. And in doing that, Aragorn is able to undergo his own character arc throughout the course of the first film. By the end of the first film, he is essentially Elisar. Even in the extended versions, you hear Sauron speak the name of Elisar of Aragorn. And it's not just a character development for him, but it's the corresponding character development for Boromir too, in terms of Aragorn accepting the fact that he is the king of Gondor, and Boromir recognizing the fact that he is the king of Gondor as he lies dying, having failed to protect Merry and Pippin from being absconded with by the Uruk-hai party. So in terms of all this character development, I believe it is very well done within the film, and you get all this across. In fact, just rewatching it recently, you pick up on more things, and again, that's what I think is the strength of a good adaptation. In terms of, you keep watching things, you keep picking up on things which you missed before. But in terms of just that,
See,
yeah,
like when I look at Aragorn's journey, I come to the opposite conclusion, but I come to the opposite conclusion because I would center a different theme, right? So the theme you have centered for Aragorn in the film is this gradual coming to grips with his destiny, right? You can see this in the scene that he has in Rivendell, where he stands before the picture of Isildur and kind of elucidates this grappling with his weakness and whether or not he's really able to come to grips with his destiny to become the king. You see this in the continuing cutbacks to his kind of these continuing cutbacks to Arwen and this struggle about whether or not they're going to get married or whether she's going to pass across the sea. Whereas in the film, what you see is Aragorn having already come to grips really prior to the beginning of the books with the idea that he's going to take up his destiny and become the king. And the struggle that he has is thematically unified with the struggle of Denethor, right? It's the struggle to play his role in Providence rather than attempt to achieve a victory in his own strength.
In terms of trying to defend Aragorn's arc here, in terms of, again, focusing back on this idea that Peter Jackson prioritized the ring as the thematic element above everything else, in here, Aragorn's development is recast specifically with regards to the relationship to Isildur, and by extension, his relationship to
That's
the
right.
ring. So it's not just redeeming himself or him assuming the mantle of kingship. It is him allowing for the quest to happen to destroy the ring, and thereby not only sort of achieving the mantle of Isildur, but overriding that mantle of Isildur, not only redeeming himself, redeeming his royal house, but also redeeming mankind as a whole. And that also reinforces into the other theme, which is communicated in the film, which is the fact that there is this fatalistic doom with regards to the fate of men. Of course,
That's right.
within
You
the
see
broad,
Elrond iterate it, where he says, men are weak. I was there the day the strength of men failed," right?
Yes, I mean, it's rather forced, but nevertheless, we have those characters. And of course, that prelude at the beginning as well, regarding the War of the Last Alliance, that also is an addition of the films to give that, to reinforce this idea of that adaptation. You almost don't need it because you do have that scene later on with Elrond facing Isildur to give that continuity between the first war for the ring and the second war for the ring in that sense. But I believe that again, all of these aspects thematically are unified within Aragorn. And when he finally receives the sword and the wheel from Elrond, it represents the culmination of his arc in terms of his embracing of destiny, and he is going to claim the mantle of the kingship of Gondor as Denethor is failing. But at the same time, Elrond has also regained his faith in man and is not only consenting to Aragorn being the husband of his daughter, and therefore putting that beside him, but he is basically saying that I will consent to placing my faith in man at the same time. So in terms of
Well, and it's
removing
an
all these,
interesting choice in the film to include this and not include the fact that Elrond's brother was king over Numenor, and to include the downfall of Numenor as the thematic element.
Oh, I agree. There's nothing about that in the film regarding Elrond's own ancestry and regarding the fact that he is Elrond half elven, going back to the history of the Silmarillion. Nothing about that is really included. And again, this is where the adaptation fails, and this is where we have to talk about streamlining in terms of
if you were
the loss of history, the loss of the character backstory, etc.
What's interesting to me about it is if you're going to center this kind of loss of faith in man as a theme, there's a really natural device native to the source material in order to make that point, rather than to insert all of this drama over whether or not Eowyn is going to pass over the sea, this drama with the
Oh, I
sword.
agree with you. I completely agree with you. I think this was, in a way, an attempt to insert a much sort of weaker aspect of the Beren and Luthien story into Lord of the Rings, when it would have been far stronger, if anything, to compare Elrond with Elros and look at Elrond's own history and the fact that he chose to be an elf as opposed to chose to be a fated man, which links into the Beren and Luthien story. All of these things are thrown at you in the film, but they're not necessarily there to complete to make it as a cohesive story. And of course, the story of Arwen and Aragorn, I'm going to say it, is far less compelling than the story of Beren and Luthien. And what I can
Yeah.
say in defense of the films is that we hear the Lay of Lethien. Aragorn sings it at one point, but there's very little in terms of elaboration of what that means to reinforce his own struggles in terms of his relationship with Arwen. So yes, definitely in terms of the broader scope of the history of Middle Earth, the films definitely suffer. But again, in terms of reinforcing this idea of what makes a good adaptation, I would argue it's enough to bring you into the world and compel you to sort of read that extended material. Yet at the same time, a very important thing for an adaptation is not to be reliant on extended material to fill in gaps in the story. The story makes sense within the adaptation, and what the extra material does is deepen your appreciation of the story.
No, I think to the points that have been raised, I would say again, it's interesting that in my mind, Amon Hen seems to be one of the key juncture points in the whole film trilogy.
Yes.
Because it's at Amon Hen that Aragorn refuses the ring directly. Whereas in the
Yes.
books that doesn't happen, right?
No.
It's kind of, he lets Frodo go in a sense, but it's very much his decision in the film. He
Can
could
I
take
point,
the ring if he
can I
wanted.
point something out, Nathan? I think
Yeah, go for it.
Amon Hen is perhaps the strongest point of adaptation in the entirety of the films. And I think in the same way that it almost juxtaposes with the weakness of the end of The Two Towers and the end of The Return of the King. Because Amon Hen is, I mean, just in terms of like, if we're going to get to battle scenes, say, for example, the Amon Hen in the film we see is far more dramatic, and the fall of Boromir is, I would say, far more epic than we see in the transition between The Return of the King and The Two Towers. And again, we see the completed arc of Aragorn, and there is so much in the way of character development within that scene. And we don't.
I just think from the point of view of the ending of a film and closing character arcs, there's so much. There's so much there. Whereas if you look at the end of The Two Towers, whose character arc is completed at the end of the Two Towers?
Though I'm going to be very cynical and say the reason The Two Towers ended that way is because Peter Jackson didn't want to replicate the gloomy, all hope is lost aspect, which I don't believe is the theme of Amon Hen. I mean, I look at Amon Hen almost like the death of Siegfried. There is that moment where we have the funeral dirge, and then the music rises up, inspiring hope in terms of the enduring the mission. The fellowship is broken, but the adventure continues.
Well, I actually think
regardless.
the fact that the choice in the film to have Aragorn explicitly refuse the ring makes that scene a scene of incredible hope, because it's the first time in the history. Well, it's the first time that the line of kings has acted properly towards the ring in the history that's portrayed in the film, right?
Absolutely. And of course, there is a similar scene in terms of the original desperation of the breaking of the fellowship with the end of the book Two Towers, which is the fate of the fate of Sam and Frodo before Cirith Ungol, after having passed through Shelob's lair. And you are left at the end of the Two Towers with this horrible cliffhanger, which really wants you to go into the Return of the King, which is the capture of Frodo, the potential loss of the ring, the end of that quest. And I believe there's enough in there in the book in terms of juxtaposing it with the defeat of Saruman and the victory at Helm's Deep to not leave you with this incredibly sort of sour taste in your mouth as you're reading The Two Towers. There is enough there in terms of evoking that hope because of course not only does the story in the book also branches out into effectively two books back to back, two stories being told. Within the film, of course, you can try it with different. You have the freedom to splice scenes here and there in a way that wouldn't make sense when you're actually writing this out and trying to maintain a consistent narrative.
I mean, he could have done what George R.R. Martin did and write one chapter about one story and another chapter about the other story and go back and forth.
But he kind
But
of
he chose not to do that,
but he kind of does that though. He does that in the sense that he doesn't have POV characters in the same way that George R. R. Martin does. You focus on one sort of POV throughout the throughout the first book, which again I would say narratively makes it all the more cohesive. And then you, by virtue, have to separate it because you've introduced these characters, and you can't simply omit their story throughout the books, and therefore you have the fracture of the characters, and then they are finally united at the end of the third book. So there is a story reason as well as a structural reason for having these points diverge. But as we see with George R. R. Martin, you create so many POV characters. Now he's left in he's basically created a literary equivalent of the Gordian knot, and there's no way of cutting through it or untying it.
One of the things that I think is really a strength of the book is you go and they're actually structured as 6 books, right? 2 in the two in the Fellowship, 2 in the Two Towers, and 2 in the Return of the King. And by telling the story of Sam and Frodo all at the end of the Two Towers, and then cutting back to telling the story of the other characters for the first half of the Return of the King, he does an amazing job of extending this cliffhanger, right?
Yes, exactly. You're constantly feeling that sense of foreboding. What's happening to Frodo and Sam? What's happening to Frodo and Sam? And that leads you, all that expectation regarding the fate of Gondor leads into the culmination of that story. Yes, I completely agree. It's masterful in a way that the films can't necessarily get across with
not
the
only that,
strict scene separation. Yeah.
If you look at the Return of the King movie, right, when the mouth of Sauron comes forth and presents the tokens, the sword and the suit of armor, you already know in the movie how that happened, and that Frodo and Sam, are struggling across the plain of Mordor, and that this is not the case, right? So it really cheapens some of those moments.
But of course, in the theatrical version, you don't even have the mouth of Sauron. I think they realized that, and that was one of the decisions why they cut it. No, you don't.
Oh, jeez. Okay.
But then that's probably actually a better decision because it doesn't have the emotional impact of the cliffhanger, right? Because it kind of seems superfluous then to bring out these objects.
It does.
You could still have the conversation. I think that's something that's lost. Tempting Aragorn, I suppose, but that's a whole other issue of how Sauron tries to tempt him right at the Black Gate. But I definitely think it's that cliffhanger into the 6th book, which you can't really have the mouth of Sauron coming out without it. The only way I think you could do it is if you did a TV series where you had 6 seasons, one per book.
There you go.
And if you did it like a box set, and I guess box sets weren't really a big thing back then.
No, that's right. You wouldn't have gone to that format at that time, right?
Mm-hmm.
If this had happened after Netflix, you would have gotten black people in it, but you would have gotten 30 hours of film. So you win some, you lose some.
Do you know what the interesting thing is, Nathan? I actually feel that this is a failure of editing, and this was a problem that could have been really easily resolved, because in the third film you have enough of because of the change in the plot. Effectively, at the beginning of the third film, they're still in Ithilien. They go to Minas Morgul and they find Shelob's lair. By the end of the second book, that's already done. And of course, you have to wait to the final book in order to have that cliffhanger resolved. However, in the films, you have enough scenes to fill in the story of Frodo and Sam. And all you then have to do is have the capture of Cirith Ungol and then cut to the back gate and the battle before then. So again, to me, all it does to resolve this is just juggle around some scenes. And I think there are some controversial moments with Return of the King. And I feel that, because again, I wouldn't say that these are perfect adaptations. I would argue they are superlative adaptations. But when you think about specific things like that, that would definitely re-emphasize the point of the struggle, and we don't know what Frodo's fate is. And I would agree with you, Nathan, that's why in the theatrical versions the scene was superfluous and they cut it out, because they've already destroyed the tension by failing to create that in editing.
Well, the other thing that I think is really interesting about the Return of the King editing choices, what's the whole conflict between whether Frodo is going to be loyal to Sam or loyal to Gollum thing going on at the beginning of the Return of the King. Right, so there's this weird scene where Gollum tries to fool Frodo into thinking Sam ate all the food when they're on the steps, and I just like, again, when we talk about the second and third movies, to me, what stands out is this indulgence in stuff that has no thematic unity with the rest of the source material, and then justifying the other editorial decisions to say, well, we didn't have enough time.
But I'd agree with you in terms of there are some things regarding Gollum that seem overindulgent, but there is a narrative reason why that exists. In cutting Sam off from Frodo, Frodo is therefore all the more easy to kill, and Gollum can retrieve the ring with sufficient ease and doesn't have to worry about Sam possibly leading a cause of retribution against him. So it makes sense, given the frailty, that Gollum would be relying on his cunning to try and get around and separate the two and divide them.
Right, but it doesn't make any sense why, like, it's not united with Frodo's character to doubt Sam in that way, right?
Well, you see, I think, and this gets into my.
I would argue.
Frodo.
Sorry, just before I forget this, Nathan. I would actually argue that this is the ring. I would actually argue that this is reinforcing the idea that Frodo, it's increasing paranoia. It's the ring wanting to get back to Sauron, and therefore Sauron wants the quest to be destroyed, and therefore turning the Fellowship against each other. Is what we see. It's you can say it's the thematic continuity with Amon Hen when Boromir attempts to take the ring, and here Gollum is dividing what is left of the Fellowship and attempting to destroy it and of course claim the ring for himself. So I would argue that there is a shallow thematic link between these two things.
So I think that's part of a broader issue with the Frodo and Sam plot during these films. As you said, the main focus is the mission to destroy the ring. So that's why you get the cut at the very beginning with the kind of first part of the Fellowship of the Ring, the adventure with Tom Bombadil and the Barrow-wights, but then also with the Scouring of the Shire. But what that leaves you then is, if you actually look at how many chapters are left, you're basically cutting off the last part of the Return of the King.
Yes.
So the half with Frodo and Sam, book 6, is considerably shorter than book 5. So to fill it out, and it makes sense chronologically at the actual events taking place at the same times, they had to move Shelob's lair into the Return of the King to give enough material. But by extension, then you still have this whole part at second half of the Two Towers that they're trying to fill out with Frodo and Sam. And this is tied into the other thing that you've just pointed out, that they're really trying to hammer home the power of the ring, because it's a hard thing to do. In the books, it's about temptation and kind of inner feeling, and you can kind of imagine that when you're reading the story, but to portray that in a visual format, I think is quite a difficult thing to do. So they've tried to go very heavy on it influencing Frodo. You see this in the Two Towers, where he's already snapping at Sam and kind of shouting at him at various points, and eventually ends up nearly giving it to a ringwraith in Osgiliath.
Yeah,
and then you see with the Gollum episode is an extension of that theme.
The theming is very obvious, even in terms of the design of Gollum and Gollum's eyes. And you see that moment just after Frodo was about to deliver the ring to the ringwraith in Osgiliath, where Sam has saved him, and then he turns on Sam and he looks at him with these crazed eyes. And again, it's very evocative of what we see with Gollum. And of course, in the third film begins with the recreation of the fratricide of Deagle by Smeagol, which creates the Gollum character. So in the film, they're very obviously trying to portray the fact that Gollum is effectively what Frodo may in fact become as a result of the contamination of the ring. And they reinforce this with the scenes, but they also try and reinforce it visually in terms of the similar aesthetic of the two characters.
Yeah, as he turns greener as he gets farther along, doesn't he? If you examine the color palette of Frodo as he approaches, like the way they do the lighting, he gets more pale and more like green as they bring him into Mordor, right?
Yeah, that's right. And you also have in Rivendell when Bilbo has that kind of attack on Frodo.
Same thing.
He looks like Gollum, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I remember you tweeting a while back, Black Horse, about the the kind of Faramir Frodo story in the Two Towers,
Oh my goodness, I hate that
and
story so much.
but I feel this is connected into it. So would you like to comment on that? Because I think it's an extension of these, because you've got rid of the Scouring of the Shire and you've moved Shelob's, the kind of events in Shelob's lair. You have to have something that's happening in the Two Towers, and there's not lots of material to deal with there.
Well,
So
actually,
then
having
they've
heard Am's
created
comments
this.
here, I think it has to do with the choice of how to portray the inner struggle of Frodo, right? So they choose to leverage this invented story where Faramir tries to deliver Frodo into Gondor as a way as a kind of narrative device to give us an opportunity to see Frodo struggle with the choice of what to do with the ring one more time.
Well, there are several things which have been published. That's one of them. Another is to find a pretext to split Gollum and Frodo. The other is to give Boromir a posthumous backstory as well, to contrast him with Faramir, which sets it up with the third film. But I do agree that the Faramir story in particular, I mean, they're almost they're almost impossible to unrecognizable. Thank you. Between the book characterization, which is
I would argue that the triangle of Faramir, Boromir, and Denethor are all kind of disfigured in the book or in the movie in order to accomplish these particular ends, right? Faramir is the most disfigured of them, Boromir the least. But in order to show Frodo struggling with the ring, in order to show that this is like his degradation rather than the expert manipulation of Smeagol or something, they give them this little side quest, and they completely undermine the idea that Faramir is the true blood of Numenor and Boromir is the false blood of Numenor, right? By making Faramir the identical equivalent morally of Boromir, until for this
Well, it's
moment.
worse than that. It's not just he's attempting to imitate Boromir, but he's the weaker version of that, which is obviously very much emphasized by Denethor. And in terms of that characterization of him in Two Towers, weakening Faramir as a character, when you are introduced with Faramir in the third film, in Return of the King, he is much closer to that portrayal of Faramir in the books, and it almost comes as some sort of whiplash when you're faced with these two characters. The Faramir willingly sacrificing himself as part of Denethor's developing madness, and the covetous Faramir who is doing everything possible to imitate his brother's legacy by frustrating the passage of the Fellowship of the Ring.
And not only that, in the book, it's supposed, like, one of the fundamental failings of Denethor is supposed to be that he misjudges his sons, right? His son Faramir is the true blood of Numenor, and his son Boromir is the false blood of Numenor, and he has the opposite perspective. And there's this highlight narrated through Gandalf about the importance of non-martial virtues when evaluating characters, but all of that collapses completely because of this choice to illustrate the influence of the ring in this particular way.
Well,
I think it goes.
Sorry, Nathan. I'm really sorry for continue to interrupt you. By the way, it's just I want to continue with this thread regarding the introduction of Faramir. The introduction of Faramir is effectively introduced from the beginning as an antagonist for Gollum, Frodo, and Samwise, whereas in the book, the introduction of Faramir is allowed to extol these qualities about the rich history of Numenor, because, of course, as Nathan and I went over when we were discussing the fall of Numenor, the thing that differentiated Numenorean society towards the end was the divide between the King's men and the elf friends. And of course, Faramir, through the usage of the elven tongue, is inviting the reader into this rich cultural backstory and association between the higher blood of Numenor and that of the elves. And all of this is completely cut out of the film.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually think though it could have been redeemable insofar as if Faramir had had an experience, say he had attacked Frodo and then realized what he had done and was repentant of it, then you could maybe understand his decision to let Frodo subsequently go. But I've never found it very convincing the end of the Two Towers where Frodo nearly gives the ring to a ring wraith
Hmm.
and then Faramir shoots the fell beast and it flies off. And he's like, "Well, now we understand each other." To me, that doesn't make any sense. If
No.
anything, I would be more inclined to take the ring back to Gondor, knowing this hobbit nearly gave it to the enemy.
That's right.
It,
It would seem suicidal to send him into Mordor, right?
So if they had made a more convincing attempt to show his change of character, then it might have had some plausibility.
Well,
But
I
because
kind of
it
think
doesn't
that
do that,
almost anything they could have done that would have been better than what they did.
But even just the way he deals with Gollum, in the
Mm.
book, it's clear why he's doing this, why the restrictions on the Forbidden Pool are there, because the Rangers in Ithilien are constantly worried about being intercepted by Orc parties. And here is a place of refuge with which they can essentially go out and attack the Orcs with impunity. And so Gollum being around obviously implies the fact that he is, a scout for the enemy. That really doesn't come across in the book. And so when Gollum is captured, it really does seem that Faramir is directly betraying Frodo for no other reason than he's petty and vindictive. And he also wants to find out more about the party, about Frodo, rather than protecting his place of refuge as well. So again, he's prioritizing his vindictiveness about Frodo and the mission of the ring ahead of his mission as a ranger of Ithilien and the defense of Gondor. So again, all of this, I will put my hands up and say that Faramir's characterization in the second film is definitely one of the weakest elements of the entire trilogy.
If I may, I'd like to just... Sorry, Black Horse, go ahead.
No, go for it. Go for it.
Well, we were kind of talking about Frodo and the effect of the ring, and they're trying to show this. And I wanted to bring us to the very climax of the film to talk about the change that they made there, because in the book, Frodo takes the ring for himself. He is attacked by Gollum, who gains the ring, is dancing for joy, and then slips to his death. Whereas in the film, you have the first few bits, so he takes the ring for himself, and then he's attacked by Gollum. Gollum wins and he's dancing, but Frodo gets back up and starts fighting again with Gollum, and they both go over the edge together. Gollum falls to his death, the ring is destroyed, and Frodo manages to hang on. Now, this in some sense, the actual kind of structure of the plot is the same. The ring is destroyed, Frodo gave into the ring, Gollum fell to his death with it, and so on. But the change, I think, is quite important because whereas in the first version, in the book version, it's this moment of utter defeat, and it's only because Frodo was merciful to Gollum and Gollum kind of destroyed himself that the ring is destroyed. In the film, it is the lust for the ring that Frodo has which leads to the destruction of the ring. If he hadn't gone and attacked Gollum, it would still have been there, but he only did so out of desire for it. So I think it changes fundamentally the cause of victory in quite a powerful way.
Yeah, I also think it moves into the realm of chance that which probably shouldn't be in the realm of chance, right?
Right, because I mean, well, here's the thing: in the book, it's never explicitly said in the text regarding that part, but there is a strong implication in earlier sections of the book and in Tolkien's letters of it being an event intended by Providence, that there was some providential design. And certainly if Gollum slips, it seems to have that more there, whereas if it's Frodo who's the agent of it, it takes that
exactly.
the full deliverance of grace, I guess.
And that moment is taken directly out of the book, of course, that quote, where we have Gandalf speaking to Frodo. Of course, it's delayed in the film adaptation where it happens much earlier in the books, but it is the essential role that I understand that Gollum may have some part to play in this. And of course, the fundamental quote that, I'm sorry, I've completely forgotten it, but I just want to chime in and completely agree with your point that I do believe Gollum as destroying the ring and Frodo, again, observing as opposed to participating, it does seem to weaken this. And again, I don't really understand why this change was made also, because I don't think it adds anything to the characters. I think it just detracts from them.
In fact, I think the like weird dance that Gollum does when he captures the ring is kind of it like it's almost silly. Act as
I would actually say, though, that this is one of the ways that the whole series could have easily gone downhill, which is the betrayal of Gollum. I feel what Andy Serkis does, for the most part, about 99% of the time,
is really
is
good. Yeah,
draw the line towards absurdity, where you look at this character, especially the betrayal of schizophrenia between Smeagol and Gollum, and you can laugh. It is very possible that someone found it hysterically funny. I didn't, obviously, but it's enough to bring you into this character and the insanity of Gollum, whilst completely understanding his motivations and making you empathize with the character, whilst the fact that the entire sort of visual characterization is computer generated as well. The fact that all of these things seem to work against the betrayal of Gollum, and yet miraculously, Andy Serkis is able to weld these elements together to make the character of Gollum realistic and believable. And also just in terms of the pure aesthetics of this, I watched the films recently in preparation for this, and you mentioned, Nathan, that the films were made 20 years ago. In terms of computer generated imagery, that could be a point against these films, especially with the quality of some computer generated imagery that was coming out in the early 2000s. And yet the imagery holds up. You're not taken out of the film when you're looking at Andy Serkis's portrayal. So that all the more reinforces the idea that they were able to almost perfect the portrayal of Gollum without turning it into a comical farce, which it could very easily been. And as Black Horse is suggesting, the moment of the victory and the capture of the ring almost turns into a farce, almost.
yeah. He does a really good job of balancing it along the way. Um, it would have been hard to take if Gollum had been a horror character all the way, right? So if you had played Gollum as a straight agent of horror, it would have been really hard to stomach the Two Towers movie.
Yes.
And so I understand the choice to play him softer, but it diminishes that moment at the end, I think.
I think the only reason why you would have the fight rather than Gollum slip to his doom is, we understand that there's a providential aspect to this, and it is mentioned in the films, but they do remove some of the references to it. I think when Elrond kind of indicates it at the Council of Rivendell, or you mentioned the ways in which all of the characters come to the Council of Rivendell, Council of Elrond. That in itself indicates a providential aspect,
right? But we don't get those stories in the stories in the movie, so maybe this is a way of hammering that theme harder.
Well, also you can't assume a modern audience is even going to think that, I think, and unless they're coming from some kind of Christian or religious background, they're not going to have that assumption necessarily. So if Gollum slips, that looks even more like chance to many people today than Frodo wrestling with him for the ring. So that could be that's the only way I could justify it. Is they recognize that a modern audience just wouldn't get maybe its deeper significance and just find it a bit anticlimactic.
I mean, in terms of trying to wrap my head around it and the ultimate betrayal, again, it does seem that in recasting this, where Frodo and Gollum are fighting over the ring, there is a thematic element there in terms of they are bringing about their own destruction and by extension the ring in fighting for the ring. And they decided to place the idea of the ring being brought about by this destruction, this unending feud. If anything, also, it's an indictment on the ring, because the ring pits people against each other.
That's right. Yeah.
It separates people. And so the fact that the ring was destroyed by the inviting obsession over the ring and the paranoia is in itself a subtle thematic irony to
Well,
it. And
in
so
point of
they,
fact, I think it would have made the battle between like the conflict on the stairs over food, etc. That would have been more thematically relevant if the ring comes to its ultimate demise in a wrestling match between Frodo and Gollum, right?
yes, absolutely. In terms of the ring being an active partner in this, and the ring wanting to survive and constantly bringing about these conflicts. So thematically, there is a link there, and it didn't immediately occur to me when you brought this comparison up, Nathan. But I think there is enough there to justify why they did that, and certainly, if the overall emphasis in the film is the corrupting power of the ring over providence and fate and a more Christian message in the film. Therefore, it seems only appropriate that Peter Jackson would prioritize this ending over chance.
I agree. I think that's a very good explanation. And I guess the other problem that I see that the climax of the story has is, and we've kind of referenced this already, I think you did, Black Horse, in The Return of the King, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields is really the main focus of the film.
Yeah.
It takes up the most runtime. It is what everything's building towards. And it is the most clear demonstration of the defeat of Sauron. But then, very quickly after, it's quite rushed, I feel.
Can we talk about the Battle of the Pelennor Fields from a thematic point of view for a minute?
Just in a second.
Sure.
I think I think the point I was I'm driving towards is, because that takes up most of the film, then it almost feels to me a little bit like an add-on at the end with the Black Gate and the destruction of the ring. Whereas actually, in terms of building a plot, you don't want your major victory of the main story of the film to have already happened before the climax.
Well, and this is the complaint that you get from people who are not interested in the books about the movie, right? The 17,000 endings of the Lord of the Rings, and the Battle of the Pelennor Fields feels like an ending because of the way that it's structured.
I think Nathan and I have talked about this before, about, again, what does the Pelennor Fields really serve? Because again, we're talking about the prioritization of the ring. There was an edit, I believe, there was an intention of having Sauron there on the battlefield confronting Aragorn. And again, George Lucas-esque, it's like
they have
poetry, it rhymes.
Is that supposed to be in Pelennor Fields, or is that supposed to be at the Black Gate?
That's supposed to be at the Black Gate. So at the beginning of the trilogy, we have the prologue with Elendil and Isildur and Elrond fighting off against Sauron. This would then come back at the end, and therefore the emphasis, I think the justification therefore was, okay, what's the real battle? Is it Aragorn fighting against Sauron, or is it Frodo trying to destroy the ring? In the prologue, it's clear that the fight against Sauron is the same thing as destroying the ring in terms of separating the rest of his body from the ring and cutting off his hand or fingers. Whereas that message, that direct correlation, isn't really there in the film, even though they tried to set it up. And so I can understand why they decided to get rid of it. And instead, you're left with this really weird scene where Aragorn is desperately trying to fight against a random cave troll. Even though this is another point I want to bring up. It sort of devalues, if anything, what we're talking about in terms of the high themes of the film. But in the first, one of the reasons I love The Fellowship of the Ring is that you feel that the characters are in peril at any given moment, that any of them could die. And this, of course, is perfectly exhibited by the death of Gandalf and the death of Boromir.
Yeah. About
halfway through the second film, after the Uruk-hai had been slain and after they leave Meduseld and they go on their trek towards Helm's Deep, around about the time the wargs attack, all of a sudden, the three, Gimli, Aragorn, and Legolas, turn into superheroes.
Yeah, that's right. I call it the marveling of Lord of the Rings at that moment.
And this lasts all the way up until the Black Gate, where all of a sudden they're in peril. And it really doesn't work, given the fact, you have ridiculous scenes like Legolas sliding down on an Uruk-hai shield at Helm's Deep and firing arrows. Then you have the even more ridiculous scene at Pelennor Fields, where he is single-handedly taking down an Oliphant, what are they called, a Mamluk, and sliding down the trunk and flying off. And of course, it leads to one of the most, epic comedic moments in the film. But nevertheless, in terms of just the pure sort of superhero characterization of Legolas, who is just an elf ultimately, compared, as with all of the other elves are shown to be vulnerable. They're not superhuman, Marvel-esque characters. And I do feel, even as a child watching these films when they came out, I did find it rather jarring going from the first film and then coming to the Battle of Pelennor Fields.
Yeah, well, and I think the death of Boromir kind of carries you through the Battle of Helm's Deep. You can kind of imagine people, you can imagine loss there. But
well, they try and recreate it directly with the death of Haldir,
yes.
which doesn't really work. And of course, that's also an invention. In terms of someone at the beginning of the comment section as a prelude, I think it was Vingol, suggested that Arwen was overused. And of course, this is another question we can bring in terms of amalgamating characters. You have to do it sometimes in order to be able to provide any sort of consistent characterization. If you throw too many names and too many characters, invariably some audience members are going to forget them, and the overall characterization suffers as a result if you have too many characters. There are films I mentioned, but I won't, in terms of keeping this conversation brief. And so the example here is obviously combining Glorfindel and Arwen in the first film, and in the second film it's combining the characters of Eomer and Erkenbrand. And of course, when it comes to Helm's Deep, Haldir was originally meant to be Arwen. So all of those scenes regarding the love story between Aragorn and Arwen.
I didn't know Haldir was originally meant to be.
No, it was meant to be
Arwen.
That's
wow.
No.
So
that would have had a payoff in terms of her fighting alongside Aragorn at the Battle of Helm's Deep. So it's interesting that someone mentioned that Arwen was turned into a girl boss, and they have no idea what it could have been if she was also there at the Battle of Helm's Deep. But yes, this is all an invention. And like I said, this does seem that Peter Jackson wanted to retell the story of Beren and Luthien, and therefore them fighting side by side at Helm's Deep would be a pale imitation of them confronting Morgoth.
I mean, that's what you get in The Hobbit, right? With Tauriel and that. What are those dwarves?
Oh, don't remind me.
But she even looks like Arwen, right?
I blotted those movies out of my memory.
I apologize.
But we do have to come back to this as we talk about the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, because the Battle of the Pelennor Fields both has too few stakes and too many, in my opinion. Right? So what are the differences between the Battle of the Pelennor Fields in the movie versus in the book? Well, there's three essential differences that I can see. First is this kind of video game action that you see in the movie, which, fine, we've talked about that. There are two others that I think are really thematically quite interesting. The first is that in the movie, the forces of Mordor penetrate, I think it's up to the third or fourth circle of the city. In the extended edition, the Witch King breaks Gandalf's staff. The city is sacked for the most part in the movie. And it's rescued, which is the other difference, not by the valor of its own men, but by an invincible ghost army.
Yes. But of course, this exists also in the books, and I would argue it's one of the weakest elements of the books, partly because I hate this sort of deus ex machina in any iteration, in any story, even though there is a justification in regards to the recognition of Aragorn as king in terms of these ghosts being beholden to him. But in terms of the direct comparison, I would actually argue that the way that we have the siege of Minas Tirith, and even the presentation of Osgiliath, it makes Gondor in the films look incredibly small, as if the entire country only consists of this city and this pile of rubble. And what the film, of course, what the books do is incorporate wider elements of Gondor. So there's no representation, say, for example, of the Knights of Dol Amroth in the films, and I can understand why they cut them out in terms of streamlining it. Yet at the same time, it does make Gondor into this microcosm, essentially, where just the separation between the two mountains, the river Anduril, and coming across in Minas Tirith is the extent of the kingdom of Gondor. And there isn't, I mean, I think there's one line to it in the film where Gandalf is lamenting the state of the defenses of Gondor. Where is the defense of the city? Where are Gondor's armies? But that's it. And the only sort of implication there we have is that essentially the rest of Gondor doesn't care if the capital city
Something
is
like
sacked.
that, yeah. Something like that. But I think there's a couple of really strange thematic elements, right? Especially the extended edition makes this point that that the Witch King is capable of overcoming Gandalf directly, which is kind of setting those two up as oppositional forces is kind of it's very out of keeping with the book. But also the fact that at the end of the battle, the victory is won without blood is kind of weird, right? If they could just have delayed the battle slightly longer, then the Ghost Army would have, wiped them out completely or something.
It does seem that, I mean, the whole use of the Deus Ex Machina again, using this as a literary device and a device in film does seem to negate everyone else's sacrifice and makes you wonder, oh, well, if this had just been delayed, if, say, for example, Aragon had got there quicker, if there wasn't so much build up before then, if, say, for example, they traveled quicker along the road to get the army of the dead, thereby by proxy, Aragon, Gimli, and Legolas are responsible for all the deaths because they didn't hurry up and achieve that. But I want to go back to your point about the Witch King, and I can understand why they cut it out of the theatrical version for obvious reasons. The Witch King is not, as you mentioned, Black Horse, the equivalent of Gandalf. Gandalf is a Maya. Not only is he a Maya, he is now the chief of the Astari as the head of the White Council.
He's the equivalent of Sauron.
He's the equivalent of, almost the equivalent of Sauron. But at the moment, he is Saruman as he was meant to be. In terms of an equivalent, of course, in the transition between Fellowship and the Two Towers, he is seen in his weaker iteration as Gandalf the Grey defeating a Balrog, who is also his equivalent in the fact that he is a corrupted Maiar. And here we have Gandalf being effortlessly sort of subdued by nothing more than a corrupted man, not a spirit, just a corrupted retainer of Sauron. So I find it very odd that they decided to put these as two sort of equivalent forces and even make the Witch King seem more powerful than he really was. And the reason they did this, rather cynically, is to make Erwin's defeat of the Witch King all the more sort of amazing, because Gandalf was effortlessly subdued, but Erwin, this random woman on the battlefield, is able to kill him.
Yeah, and the other part of this that I think damages the theme of the movie just as a movie rather than as an adaptation, though I think it's a poor adaptational element as well, is that the forces of Mordor enter the city of Gondor and they begin to sack it. Which really, I mean, this is a comment I have about the battle scenes in both the Two Towers and in the Return of the King. They're trying to make them the battles as close as you could possibly make them, right? And the choice to begin the sacking of the city really adds to this impression as a viewer of the movie that this is the climax of the movie rather than the climax of the movie coming at the destruction of the ring. And I think this is just a very poor element of the way that this was adapted.
And of course, in the theatrical versions, you don't really have any aftermath for it either. You don't see the destruction. Whereas both in the book and in the extended version, you try and intercede with regards to the House of Healing scene. But even then, in terms of the portrayal in the films, it's not enough to get across the idea of the overall suffering and the death toll that this has taken. And this leads to the rushed resolution with the Battle of the Black Gates.
Well, and one of the interesting thematic one of the interesting elements of the book is after the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, you kind of emotionally feel as though you've had a great victory, and then you have the council on the fields, and they talk about the fact that they're not in any better position than they were, 6 months ago or a year ago, right? They may have won this battle, but this battle will occur again and again and again until Gondor falls. And instead, they make this choice to go walking into the jaws of death, right? And I think this is a element that the movie really struggles with, because I don't think it articulates the strategic situation of the war very well.
I think there's another aspect to the Black Gate. I mean, they try and give an element of strategy when you have that scene in the second film, in the Two Towers, where they're hovering over the map and they're trying to describe that Sauron and Saruman is encircling the world of men from
Yeah.
two fronts. But apart from that, you really don't get any sort of greater strategic impression up until that point, other than the fate of Osgiliath, which in the film is presented as switching hands multiple times. But you don't really understand what that means, because Osgiliath is a dead city. There are no people living in Osgiliath. All the population has been deserted. So recovering it, given how tentative the recovery is,
Doesn't
seem
feel
to
like it has any value, right?
doesn't seem to have any sort of value. I mean, it's just a stepping stone ultimately on the way to attacking Minas Tirith. But again, this is a problem with world building, and this is why sacrificing elements such as Dol Amroth has a negative effect on the film. Even I would say in Rohan, this is demonstrated better in terms of the overall sort of vulnerability of the kingdom and the expanse of the kingdom, and how they even gave up the capital, believing it was of limited strategic utility. So even within Rohan, you kind of feel that the entire country is left utterly defenseless, and therefore we have to retreat to Helm's Deep. I could go on a tangent. We were mentioning before we came on live about with Gimli, you can see battles. I would love to actually talk about Helm's Deep and all these sort of design features of Helm's Deep, which make it one of the worst places in terms of.
Before we get to Helm's Deep, can we talk about? So Helm's Deep is like pitch darkness, right? It's the shadow of Sauron, and yet the Battle of the Pelennor Fields takes place on like a cloudy day, whereas there's this whole thing in the book where the shadow of Sauron goes out and covers all the world in this kind of great darkness.
There is a reference to this in the films where the sortie of the army of Sauron out of Minas Morgul is accompanied with this great cloud, as you mentioned, and the cloud is meant to ease the suffering of the various dark creatures, from orcs to trolls, as they pass through the light. But again, this whole idea that the evil creatures are suffering as a result of the sun. I mean, Nathan and I have talked about the thematic reasons as to why that's the case and why the sun was created after the fall of the trees, etc. But that's deep lore. That's really neither here nor there. But it's something that's inconsistent throughout the film, and because you see so many orcs traveling throughout the day, even in the Two Towers, where you see the orc party meet up with the Uruk-hai party, there's a reason why the orc party and the Uruk-hai party meet up in the Two Towers. And it's nothing to do with them just checking on the Uruk-hai, because the Uruk-hai are presented in the films as super soldiers, because they amalgamate various elements of the orcs, yet they are stronger than them, and they can pass through the day without having to rest, without having to eat. However, when you include that scene in the Two Towers, the fundamental sort of element there is of Saruman's allegiance. Do we take the ring to Isengard, or do we deliver the ring to a ring wraith who will then take it to Mordor? And so the orcs and the Uruk-hai are almost at a point of civil war in the Two Towers. Yet what's the civil war about in the films? It's over eating the hobbits. It's just again, it's inconsistent in terms of the characterization of what the powers of the various creatures are. I mean, in the first film, it's very sort of well presented. When we have the attack of the troll and when we have the attack of the goblins, it's in the pitch darkness of the mines of Moria. When we have the passage of the Urukai, we are told it is because these creatures are bred for this purpose. They are superior to the goblins and the various orc creatures which they have confronted thus far, and use the darkness as some sort of cover. And the only scene we have to justify this in the third film is a scene which I believe is deleted in the theatrical version, which is the creation of the beacon of Minas Morgul and the great cloud which covers the battlefield. And of course, in the film, you can say this is justified because this is a scene. This is a siege, sorry, which occurs over over a series of days, and thereby you're going to have to siege during the day, and you're going to have to siege during the night. But as you say, the Battle of Pelennor Fields happens during the day, and the way they get around that is to focus on the idea that this is originally a victory for the Rohirrim, and then who replaces the orcs? It is the Mamluks, and it is the evil men. And again, in terms of trying to emphasize how you need the extended versions in order to make this work, there is one scene, one brief scene where Haradrim is shot down by a ranger of Ithilien in the second book. And Faramir laments on the fact, why did this man turn to evil? Perhaps he could have been one of us in any other circumstance. Because of that, you really have no characterization for the evil men in the story once you take out that scene.
Well,
But I would argue in the film's defense, therefore, that the Battle of Pelennor Fields is understandable because it is principally evil men fighting against the Rohirrim, and the orcs are obviously easily dispersed in the film.
that might be true. Yeah, fair enough. The other thing that's in the books that's kind of interesting is the account from Sam, which emphasizes that the raid of Faramir on the convoy is his first sight of a war between men, and how disgusting he finds that.
Yeah.
Maybe in its slight defense of the Battle of Pelennor Fields and Helm's Deep, you were mentioning the visuals of light and dark, and I appreciate it's not in terms of the lore consistent, but I think why it's cloudy is it starts cloudy, then they enter the city and it turns to night in the Battle of Minas Tirith, and it's with the coming of the Rohirrim that dawn is there. So it's a visual cue that there is hope. But the problem is, of course, the Rohirrim aren't the true deliverance. So actually, it would be better if it had still been dark, and then Aragorn with the ghosts would have been when the dawn came. It's slightly doesn't work. Whereas with Helm's Deep, it very much works because you've got the promise that Gandalf will return at light, and the actual battle has all been in the night. So it works very effectively, and I think what they're trying to do, not necessarily I don't think it's as powerful in the Pelennor Fields, but certainly with Helm's Deep, it's the eucatastrophe that they're really trying to express in these battles. The point of ultimate despair, so the city being sacked, or Helm's Deep nearly being destroyed, and then deliverance. That's what they're trying to get and trying to make you feel at the end of these battles.
I would argue, though, that thematically, Helm's Deep is therefore the better battle because of this
I agree.
simple message. I mean, even strategically, I can say that Minas Tirith makes more sense than Helm's Deep. That doesn't really sort of matter in the end because we have a clear enemy. There aren't any unusual surprises. I mean, I always found it very anticlimactic watching the third film, where Theoden has dispatched the orc host, and then he turns, and out of nowhere, the Mamluks are appearing on the horizon. I mean, just as anyone who has any understanding of how battles work, the idea that an entire army of giant elephants can just appear out of nowhere and take an army completely by surprise is just completely ludicrous. The idea that there are no scouts, there are no advance parties, there is no strategic appraisal of the battlefield.
They're giant elephants.
I know. It's just we charge. Oh fuck.
Theoden's somebody I wanted to come on to, actually, because I feel he gets a bit of a raw deal in the films. He does get his being freed from the poisons of Wormtongue, who actually I think Wormtongue is one of the best portrayals of any character in the film.
Absolutely, yes.
He is a brilliant actor, that man. But he does. There's this sense in Return of the King that Theoden feels it was Aragorn's victory, Helm's Deep, not his own, and he still hasn't achieved glory yet. He then leads the Rohirrim into battle, which is a glorious thing. But
well, there's this weird moment
when you look
in
at
the
Go
films
ahead.
where he like wonders if he's going to respond to the red arrow or something. Like he toys with the idea of just not coming when Gondor calls, which is I don't understand why that's a conflict in the movie.
Well, and then there's this other thing as well where it's so Eowyn clearly gets glory in the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Not only does she slay the Witch King, she actually kills a Mumakil at one point.
Yes, she does.
Eomer kills a Mumakil. or at least Eomer kills the driver of a Mumakil with a spear, and then
which causes actually Eomer actually has the highest kill count of all of them because he javelins a sorry, it's a Mamakil. Thank you. Sorry, Mamelukes. It's Egyptian history crossing over into my head. Islamic history crossing over. But the Mumakil is killed and then goes into another Mumakil and brings both of them down. Eowyn cuts the inner legs of a single Mumakil, and this brings it down. And of course, Legolas brings down the Mumakil. And again, this is just ridiculous. I'm talking about just from a fantasy setting. We're comparing sort of Mumakil kill counts now.
but so you've got that world, and it is ridiculous. But Theoden never gets a moment where he truly shines on screen.
No,
he doesn't.
To contrast with the book where he's portrayed as if he's like one of the gods out of history, riding up with his golden shield, and then dying in glorious battle against the Witch King.
I would push back against this slightly, actually, and say just on the characterization of Theoden. I mean, I was watching the films with a friend recently, and I was trying to explain this. We are introduced to Theoden as completely lacking in any autonomy. He is effectively a corpse which is being manipulated by the manipulation of Grimmer and the witchcraft of Saruman. And Gandalf is essential in terms of bringing him out of this stupor and realizing his own autonomy. Thereby, autonomy and sovereignty is the key focus for Theoden's character to some extent within that first story. When Aragorn comes, I mean, you can say it's even worse in the books because Aragorn already wields Anduril, and he already has that sort of imbued mantle of kingship to a much greater extent than it exists in the film at this point. So the idea of a threat to his legitimacy, to the idea that Theoden has simply been released from one form of bondage, and now he has been faced towards the descendant of Isildur, of the blood of Numenor, because, of course, within the context of the films, the Rohirrim are very much, the men of Rohan are very much not degenerated, but lesser iterations of men compared to that blood of Numenor. So in terms of asserting his power against Aragorn, he is asserting his rights and sovereignty as a king and not wanting to be placed back into the situation of submission towards another powerhead. And this is demonstrated through Helm's Deep when you have that final scene.
They do a nice job with that.
Where Aragorn isn't supporting Theoden in the way that, a liege supports a vassal. He is treating him as an equal, and he is allowing Theoden to recapture this aspect of sovereignty and to ride out and to confront the men. And I find that when we have these elements in the third film, they are trying to bring back these inner doubts of Theoden and him assuming this mantle of kingship, which would evoke the power and prestige of his ancestors. And bear in mind, not only is Theoden incapacitated, Theoden allows the rape of his kingdom and the death of his son and heir.
And there's a heavy implication in the films that he may have allowed the rape of his daughter as well.
Yes, exactly. Well, it's obvious when you see that look between and obviously we also see the face of Eowyn and Grimmer being promised Eowyn as a gift. I mean, the rape of the kingdom could continue, and Theoden therefore is overcompensating. And you can say, if anything, he's justifiably paranoid. Yet when he is accepting the the message of the beacon, essentially the call of aid from Gondor. He has finally gotten over that, and he is prepared to fulfill his role as king of Rohan, but also as the vassal and the ally of the king of Gondor, and riding with the king of Gondor to allow him to claim his throne, yet also fulfilling that ancient role. And I do believe he has that moment to shine when he gives that speech and he leads the Rohirrim to that first easy victory against the great army of orcs. However, I think this is also an issue with editing. I believe the victory over the orcs and the sudden arrival of the Oliphaunts negates his victory, and you can say pulls the rug from underneath him. Of course, that's the intention, but in the way that it was characterized in the film, it makes him look like an idiot. I'm afraid to
Yeah.
say.
It's not well executed.
We've got about 15-20 minutes left, so I wondered if there was any themes or topics that you guys wanted to address before we get to the end of the stream.
I think it's worth spending a few minutes here to congratulate the film adaptation for the quality of the aesthetics and the way the aesthetics successfully communicate themes. So I've spent most of this stream ragging on the plot restructuring and how I believe it kind of undermines some critical themes that that I think were intended to be put across by the author. Having said all that, both the visual aesthetics, apart from notwithstanding this discussion of light and darkness we've just had, and the musical aesthetics, they did an unbelievable job portraying this sort of dark age world in decline kind of aesthetic. I still, a decade plus later, can't get over how well they communicated that.
I would absolutely agree with you, and I would argue that the only sort of thing that's jarring from me is not from a point of view of adaptation, but a point of view of history. There are detractors of Tolkien who say that the world feasibly could have appeared far more fantastical, and Jackson made the decision to make the world that much more grounded and imitate real life history, even though as Nathan and I have gone into, we're going into this idea of prehistory and mythology. And I mean, we've even talked about Egyptian architecture. Your mind can go wild given how much license Tolkien gives the character. In terms of the characterization of the elves, it's almost perfect to portray the elves at this time, because we're left, of course, we're not portraying Valinor. And I'm very happy that they didn't portray Valinor, because it's in terms of its very sort of identity, it is inconceivable to the eyes of men.
That's right.
We can't even look at it. But we're also seeing degenerated forms of the elven kingdoms. We're not looking, say, for example, of the kingdom of Doriath as ruled over by Thingol. We're not talking about Gondolin, say, for example, and under King Turgon. Instead, we're seeing these lesser iterations of the last sort of ancient kingdoms in the form of the House of Elrond in Rivendell, which I think is beautifully portrayed in terms of that welding of Far Eastern Japanese, but also Norse architecture to create this thing which is almost sort of recognizable, almost sort of derivative from various architectural styles, but transforms into its own thing. The same thing could be said about the music. Howard Shore doesn't just rip off Wagner. He uses Wagner as a template and is able to transform it into something else, into something which makes the score of The Lord of the Rings truly unique, even though it lends very clearly on Wagnerian themes, such as the choruses and such as the obvious indebtedness to consistent leitmotifs. But of course, within Lord of the Rings, I can't really fault the score, even though sometimes I can think, isn't that a little bit too close to the Meister singers or a bit too close to Parsifal? No, it's enough to get you into the film and bring about this idea of, a drama, an epic drama, and the music is evoking these feelings of fantasy and otherworldness. It does that successfully. Lothlorien, of course, is the closest thing we get to otherworldliness within the construct of these three films. And I feel also in terms of the portrayal of Galadriel, they achieved that probably as best as they could have. However, I'll come back to the portrayal of men and say that here it is the desire to go historical that actually weakened my appreciation of the film, not from an aesthetic point, but purely from a practical standpoint, in the sense that Nathan and I have discussed this again, the idea that the Shire and the Hobbits serve as some form of time warp, some form of anachronism within the universe of Lord of the Rings. And this works very well for the Hobbit in terms of inviting you into this universe and allowing these characters to bring, to bring the audience into the story. However, when you combine the Hobbit, say, for example, the Village of the Hobbits, which could be any period. I mean, you could even say it could be as late as, say, for example, the early 19th century in terms of how the Shire is portrayed. Then you go to Rohan and you look at the architecture there. And it's obvious why the architecture exists like this, because Rohan is another example of it's sort of English culture inserted into the story. It is evocative of the philology of the word horser from Hengist and Horsa, meaning an English Mercian civilization derived from the horse. However, as a consequence of that, you now have an 8th, 7th century civilization juxtaposed with something that could be as recent as the 19th century. And then you go to Minas Tirith, which is sort of quintessentially sort of high medieval. Maybe you can say that it's sort of Byzantine in terms of its overall structure, and you can say that this represents, Golden Age Byzantium under the Macedonian dynasty, if I'm going to be really sort of particular and historical about this. But I think regarding the construction of the non-elven races, this is rather jarring for me, whereas I find the fantasy elements don't suffer from this. So the elven civilizations give across an aspect of timelessness and, again, ancientness of old age, as do the dwarven civilizations, interesting enough. And every civilization has its own aesthetic within the Lord of the Rings, which reinforces the whole assessment of their character. So the dwarves, obviously, great miners, great craftsmen. They are the creations of Aule, the Valar associated with crafts and created so they can appreciate that craft. So it's appropriate that their halls would be described as such. Whereas the elves are, of course, portrayed as being more, of course, in tune with the natural creation of the world, and obviously those themes are exhibited, whilst the hobbits are represented as that perfect English anachronism, and therefore the managed civilizations should exist historically as these sort of faux medieval settings. But within those faux medieval settings, there are some aspects that do take me out of the film, but I can understand why they're there, and in some ways they're good adaptations, but they bring you out of the world at the same time.
Yeah, I think a lot of credit has to go to Alan Lee and John Howe on this front, because they were the two concept artists for the films. But what I think is very interesting is that Alan Lee had been doing illustrated versions of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings prior to the films. So they were both artists who had a great love for the work and understood its themes, and
the theme that I think they did such a great job with is the theme of decline.
Yes.
Right? So everywhere you go in the world, you get this picture of the decline of the world of men and the decline of the world of elves, and it's brilliantly passed along. The other aesthetic qualm that I would have with the films is with the portrayal of Lorien as this kind of. So if you look at the portrayal of Lorien in the books, it's portrayed as this almost piece of the First Age carried forward into the modern world.
Well, not just piece of the First Age, even before then, because Galadriel is one of the few figures existing in Middle-earth who transported along with Valinor within that first passage. So she is actually part of the era of the trees. So if anything, this is even older.
Yeah, actually, that's fair enough. It's not the First Age; it's the years of the trees. It's forever ago. And I can understand why they decided to portray that as the kind of dreamlike world that is Lorien in the film. But the dream doesn't feel like a good dream to me.
I think that's intentional, though. I mean, that's the sort of impression I get. It's unsettling, deliberately unsettling to the hobbits, because it is so alien, it is so fantastical, and therefore bizarre. I mean, I find the fascinating thing about Lothlorien is that it is simultaneously evocative of awe, but also of terror. And this is the impression you also get from Gimli as they pass into Lothlorien, in that you don't really know what side Galadriel is on. And of course, this is reinforced with the fact that she is communicating with the members of the Fellowship telepathically, and you don't really understand why she is doing this. And of course, this is exhibited when we have her struggle over the ring. So
Right.
there is
But in the
a terrible power associated with this, and there is associated with this ancientness, which is also alien and therefore, in some aspects, beautiful, haunting, horrifying, almost as a visual extension of Galadriel herself.
but in the books on Exit, it's clear that this is beautiful. That Lorien is beautiful beyond sort of touching. Right. It's illustrated in Gimli's request to get 3 strands of the lady's hair. Right.
Oh, I agree with you, and I think
If
this is
they,
some sort of I mean, Gimli goes through his own little character arc
yeah,
in Lothlorien. He starts off as completely hostile, as per his general hostility towards the elves, which is demonstrated toward Legolas, and he says, it's quite comical, I am a dwarf who she shall not ensnare so easily. And Gimli, towards the end, is utterly ensnared, though not in the way he had anticipated.
yeah. Well, and the choice to, if you think about the aesthetics provided in the book, in the film, it would have seemed quite odd to have Gimli exit the wood and ask for 3 strands of the lady's hair. That would not have fit the aesthetic put across in the movie, right? And so I can forgive this because in the book they spend 40 days in Lothlorien, and it's very difficult to portray in film the kind of journey that you go on. Like they would have had to do a montage or something in Lorien to explain this.
And that would have taken away from it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I can kind of I understand why the format makes Lorien extremely difficult, but I would say it's the one place where they struggle to get the aesthetics over. Compared to I think just about everywhere else, they do a borderline perfect job in my assessment of putting the aesthetics over.
I think there's probably one thing which I didn't get across in terms of the aesthetics, which is if you look at things like Orthanc, Orthanc on the one hand is brilliantly designed. You also don't get the impression that this was a Numenorian creation. You get the impression that Orthanc, especially in contrast to its surroundings, is already the home of an evil wizard. In the same way,
fair enough.
in the same way that you get that impression with Barad-dûr, the aesthetic of Barad-dûr and the aesthetic of Orthanc are very similar. And the thing which they need to get across is the fact that this is managed design. And this is managed design which has been corrupted. However, the consistent design of Orthanc and Minas Morgul and the Black Gate, etc., all this does is to convey that this has nothing to do with men. This is some sort of evil aesthetic. And if anything, looking back on it in hindsight, you can almost ask, why was Gandalf so easily sort of captured by Saruman when he clearly already had the orc aesthetic in terms of his architecture? Yeah. So I think in terms of fidelity to the story, that is probably in terms of the architecture, that is the thing I find most jarring.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I hadn't considered that before, but you're quite right.
I wanted to just comment on the music just for a second, because I think you're right, AM, that it is it's Wagnerian in some of the motifs that it takes up, but also in the sense that it Shaw assigns themes to different characters and ideas, and he actually almost tells the story through the music and the development of those ideas,
Well, that's
and the
pure
way that they
that's pure
interact.
Wagnerian, yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
precisely. So what you're getting in an audible sense is an epic, which is telling you the story, but also moving you in line with the story. The visuals might not necessarily always move you, but when you hear that music, you feel what it wants you to feel. And I think for me, the music is the thing which is actually closest to the books in terms
Yeah.
of what it's displaying,
And you can
and
hear
makes you
this.
feel the most similar to
And
when
Joe, the
it's like
funny
really
thing
You can
about
hear
this
this if
is,
you.
sorry,
There are
Michael.
there are a number of audiobooks that are set to the music, and the music works with the audiobooks way better than the visuals would have worked with the audiobooks.
Do you know what the funny thing is, Nathan? I think this, if anything, it reinforces the unspoken sort of aspect of Tolkien, which is comparing Lord of the Rings to Wagner. It seems only appropriate that Wagner, because there is so much in the way of similarities between the Ring of the Nibelungen and the Lord of the Rings, that in terms of the portrayal of the films, that similarity, that uncomfortable similarity, is brought across. But you can see it in terms of the horrifically unsettling nature of the music. Say, for example, delving deep into the pits of Isengard, and you hear the clashing of metal, almost identical to descending into Nibelheim with the creation of the weapons of war to be fashioned by Albrecht. And then you enter into that celestial high, which is very evocative of the conclusion of Parsifal. But in defense of Howard Shore and defense of the film, Howard Shore is able to take this structure and he's able to, less successfully, I would argue, with the comparison with Rheingold and Isengard, but he's able to transform it and make the composition into its own thing.
I think as well, if we've been mentioning the Silmarillion, I think it works on a thematic level in terms of the Ainulindale as well.
Yeah.
That all of Tolkien's world is the product of song, of symphony, and so in a sense, you could even see Shore's score
as a
as kind
demonstration of the music
yeah.
of the music of the Ainur, and the various themes coming through as representing the various, not just the characters, but also the races and thereby the themes. And yes, I completely agree with you. There is that thematic element which comes across completely subconsciously. You don't need to know anything about the Silmarillion or the creation of the world and the understanding of the theme and the creation through music in order to get this across. There is also an aspect about the film and the idea of subcreation. And of course, we find out in the end that the story of Lord of the Rings, and as with The Hobbit, is the subcreation of Frodo, as the Hobbit was the subcreation of Bilbo Baggins, and the idea of the transformative nature of these independent subcreations and that of storytelling, and Tolkien's desperate attempt to find some form of narrative device to introduce the Silmarillion, and focusing, say, for example, on the Red Book of Westmarch, which is found in Rivendell. So even though these elements aren't completely obvious, there's enough in the film in order to bring you into this world and bring you into this idea of the transformative nature of music, the elevating nature of music, and again, to bring that uncomfortable comparison, how Wagnerian ultimately Tolkien is.
The only point which isn't Wagnerian, actually, in some sense, is the music of the Shire, which again speaks to your point of it being out of place with the rest of the world. But it's more like a Vaughan Williams.
Yes, I was about to
piece.
bring up Lark Ascending, or
Yeah.
some other composition of Vaughan Williams where there is this utter tranquility. Even though I would say there is some similarity between Lark Ascending and, say, for example, the Prelude to Lohengrin, regarding that brief serenity. But I would say, in terms of the simplicity of the music, again, Wagner does grandiose, and it's quite hard to sort of transpose Wagner into The Hobbit and the Shire. And in complete sort of fairness to Tolkien, the Shire is that wonderful English sort of anachronistic creation, which completely contrasts with the Wagnerian sort of obsession around the central character of Siegfried, in the sense that here, Aragorn is not the main character. He is simply a part of a bigger story.
So we've got a little bit extra time, actually, because UO's going to be starting a bit later. So I wondered if you just wanted to briefly talk about casting and the performances, because I think we've kind of spoken about some of the characters, but I think in general, that from my perspective, I think most of the actors seem right for their parts. I think there's only one or two that I would really question.
Well, let's talk about the questionable ones, and the most interesting.
Yes, I'm curious, Nathan. Which are the questionable ones in your view?
Emo Frodo, I
Yeah.
guess is my one. He's it's a very interesting choice to reduce his age from 50 to younger than most of the other characters. I I actually do have questions about Ian McKellen as Gandalf. I know that's going to be really controversial, but when I hear that Sean Connery could have played him, something in me feels the mischievousness and the danger of Connery
Well,
and the
can I
kingliness.
go on Ian McKellen just on that tangent?
Go for it.
Regarding Ian McKellen, because I watched these films when they first came out, and I was very, very young when they came out. But they were the first sort of introduction to real fantasy at the time, so I was just completely sort of overawed by them. And I think the wonderful thing about them is that I can rewatch them and realize it wasn't just nostalgia. These films do hold up, even
By the
with
way,
my sort of mature. Yeah.
by way of background, did each of you read the books first or watch the films first?
Well, I was 6 when the first film came out,
I see.
so I read the books afterwards.
Likewise.
Yeah, so I think it substantially colors your view. I read the books and most of the Silmarillion before I watched the movies. So I think that kind of I didn't experience quite the same sense of awe that I think I would have had it occurred in the other order.
So on Ian McKellen, I keep coming back to Ian McKellen's portrayal as Gandalf the Grey in The Fellowship of the Ring. And there is something very sort of warm and nostalgic about coming back to that film. And it's one of the reasons why The Fellowship of the Ring is my favorite of all of the film adaptations by far. And but also it's not just the friendly wizard portrayal, but it's also his transition between the Doom Gandalf, the serious Gandalf, the war party leader, etc. Everything about the portrayal of Gandalf the Grey from Ian McKellen to me is just. I mean, I can't even imagine any other actor playing that role now, even when I read the books. However, when it came to the second film, I was very disturbed and rather put off by his portrayal of Gandalf the White. And at first, I thought that was a detriment to the films and Ian McKellen's portrayal. However, when I was slightly older, I began to realize that this isn't a literal reincarnation in the same, and sorry, a literal sort of coming back to life in the sense that Gandalf the Grey is simply Gandalf the Grey again. When we're introduced to Gandalf the White, there is a audio trick where some lines are delivered by Ian McKellen and some lines are delivered by Christopher Lee. And in the extended version, it's then illustrated that, I thought you were Saruman. And Legolas says, I thought you were Saruman. And then Gandalf simply responds, I am Saruman, or rather, Saruman as he was meant to be. And it's this understanding that Ian McKellen is actually playing two fundamentally different characters. And only on occasion do you see that break between Gandalf the White and Gandalf the Grey. And funny enough, it's actually with the response to Pippin and how he brusquely chides Pippin in the same way that a old grumpy man would chide a child, which is effectively the first relationship. But even then, his relationship with Pippin undergoes a significant arc throughout this. And I feel the fact that Gandalf is two characters and that Ian McKellen was actually able to successfully distinguish Gandalf the White from Gandalf the Grey, yet that it leans enough on the Gandalf the Grey character to have little aspects of life which brings you back to that original portrayal is actually something which really, in hindsight, elevated Ian McKellen's performance for me, even though I still watch it back to back and find it rather unsettling.
I would make one other comment. If you look at Gandalf the White's character in the books, it's described that after the War of the Ring is concluded, he laughs more. He's kind of got this jolly side to him, and
Yes, and you see that briefly when Frodo is finally reunited with Gandalf the White, and there's that scene where they're all jumping on the bed.
Yeah, but I feel like the film really struggles with that transition. Every time I watch that scene, I just it doesn't. There's something about the aesthetic there that just doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem like a real scene. It seems like they're dreaming or something. And I think one of the struggles of the film and one of the struggles of the direction is to find a way back after this like long journey in the dark, to find a way back to positive aesthetics and joy. And I think part of that is that part of the film is quite short, and it's just I don't know how you would do it better, but I find as a viewer uh, that I really struggle with it.
I think in part because it's just such a juxtaposition, isn't it? From the last thing you saw before that was Frodo and Sam lying on the side of Mount Doom, prepared
Expecting to
to
die.
die,
Yeah.
and then they wake up laughing. It kind of I get that. Well, I kind of get you want to show that this is a great relief to them, but you wouldn't burst out laughing if that was what happened to you.
Well, this is why I believe. I mean, the dream imagery is quite obvious, and I felt that same way when viewing the scene, and continue to do so. And I actually believe that is intentional. It is meant to be this sort of almost absurd state of detached reality from the horror they have just been through, and then coming to the deliverance. And I think the reason they decided to do that was almost to try and, in a way, imitate the aesthetics of Gandalf's own resurrection. He has fallen through fire. He has confronted the Balrog, and he comes back through, I can't remember, each day felt like the eternity of the life of the earth, etc. And through that dream, I awoke and I was alive again. And I feel that they were trying to replicate that imagery with Frodo having gone through his own almost literal baptism of fire and having been delivered and become this post sort of trial character as a result of it. That was just my own impression aesthetically from it.
Yeah, I mean, if you contrast that scene to the scene in Fellowship of the Ring where Frodo wakes up and Gandalf is sitting by his bedside, I just think that emergence from horror into positive is done much better than the one at the end of the
But I
film.
think that's intentional though. The first one, there is a lesser horror, and there therefore is a lesser relief, and this is the greater horror, and this is the greater relief, and therefore it's all the more jarring that you have that direct juxtaposition. And I do believe these scenes are intended to be put side by side and to show the development of the character, because within the first little deliverance of Frodo, he is struck with the Morgul blade. But this is simply the beginning of his journey. And towards this, he has completed so much more and embarked on this quest and destroyed the source of Sauron's power. And we also find out, as with a dream, that it is also somewhat illusory, because Frodo will not recover from
can't
this.
recover,
He
right.
has sacrificed too much, and he will have to fade and go into the Undying Lands rather than remain on Middle Earth with the wounds incurred as a result of this. So I believe in both senses, not just in terms of creating a visual analogy to both the earlier scenes in Fellowship and the scene with Gandalf, I do believe the dream state is meant to be some sort of illusory pseudo reality before the reality of the punishment, the wounds inflicted on Frodo, comes through and culminates in the ending of the film.
So I think we ought to begin wrapping it up. So I want to give both of you a chance just to.
Oh no, it's possible. Just one point before we go, Nathan. Because
Okay.
I came in as Saruman, and I have to talk about Christopher Lee and
Yes,
his portrayal. I think Christopher Lee was perfectly cast, and just for viewers don't know, Christopher Lee is also, I believe, one of the only cast members who actually met with J.R.R. Tolkien himself in the 1970s. So it's wonderful to me to see Saruman and his portrayal within the film, and I feel that Christopher Lee was so evocative as Saruman that I almost feel it's one of the very few cases in the film where Peter Jackson overindulged and created many more scenes for Christopher Lee Saruman than the plot really entails, because as we know from the books,
Well, and in a certain sense, diminishes Sauron because
yes,
of
it does. It does.
how
And this,
strong a figure Christopher Lee is.
and this is the interesting thing. This is why I find almost Peter Jackson having given so much airtime to Saruman in the second film. I mean, basically every other scene is him consulting with orcs about, do this, send out the riders, cut down the trees, etc. And then you have nothing in the theatrical release of the third film. And I believe that's almost by design
Yeah,
to
he doesn't
really
even die.
I know, to really hammer home the idea that Saruman is no longer the big baddie, it's Sauron. But of course, this is rather jarring because Saruman gets so much airtime in the first film and the second film. He is, if anything, the primary antagonist of the first two films. And having served that role, he is basically cast off onto the ash heap. And one wonders why. And I think it is this cynical realization that you have built up the secondary antagonist to such a degree that any sort of conflicting messages in the third film would make you question who the ultimate antagonist is. And coming back to the central point, which Peter Jackson was wanting to get across, which is the centrality of the ring. And this is another thing I would say actually Saruman's character suffers for in this portrayal. We don't actually understand what Saruman would do with the ring. We are given his character motivation, which is rather obvious and understandable, in that he wants to side with the winning power. But there is this moment when Gandalf basically says there is only one Lord of the Ring, only one who can bend it to his will, and he does not share power. So is Saruman just hopelessly naive and willing to just buddy up with Sauron? And again, there's a precedent in this, in the way that Saruman was a very loyal servant to Morgoth. Or something which is left out from the books, does Saruman want to take the ring? And does he want to overcome Sauron in the full knowledge of this, in the same way that we see a hint of it with Galadriel? So I find it interesting, the portrayal of Saruman, because we have all of these extra scenes. He has so much more presence in the films, and yet, ironically, in the books, the character portrayal is actually that much more nuanced and developed without the scenes. And of course, this culminates in the Scouring of the Shire, and why I believe it does serve as almost like a perfect opposite to what the Fellowship have achieved in terms of the overall totally corrupting influence of service to evil and the death of Saruman and the patheticness of the decline towards the end. That to me is one of the weakest aspects of the adaptation, despite the fact that I can enjoy Christopher Lee's added airtime. As a result, you can see Peter Jackson's infatuation with the character. Yet, ironically, he was unable to present the character in a way that was as compelling as the book.
Yeah, I think that's very well said.
Very, very. And one question I want to put to you both then is, Christopher Lee actually went for the role of Gandalf first. So what would you think of him having played Gandalf?
Dracula as Gandalf is an interesting idea, in the same way that having James Bond as Gandalf would have been an interesting idea. Unfortunately, I just can't see it. I mean, I have seen enough Christopher Lee films to think that he would still give it his all, and he would be able to juxtapose, and the transformation, therefore, into the magisterial, papal-esque Gandalf the White would feel more earned. And I do feel that, interestingly enough, again, you can say, in benefit to give Christopher Lee the benefit and to actually detract a bit from Ian McKellen, Saruman, even at his end, and this is why I believe almost that scene had to be cut out, Christopher Lee at his end seemed more domineering and magisterial and authoritative than Gandalf the White ever did, which I find rather interesting.
Yeah,
And
my view is that Christopher Lee would have made a better Gandalf the White, and Ian McKellen made a better Gandalf the Grey.
And I would agree completely with that.
That would have been an interesting way to do it, actually. And then a final one on casting, because Aragorn was a last-minute introduction. There was another actor who had actually been given the part who kind of took to drink and wasn't learning his lines, and they had to get rid of him. And Viggo Mortensen gets called in at the very last minute. They're already shooting, and he does the job. So one, what do you think of his performance? A very last minute. But two, well, they did originally offer it to Nicolas Cage. So what do you think of you on
that? I think Viggo did a very good job, a much better job than Nicolas Cage would have done, I think. My comment about this is that I don't think modern Hollywood is capable of properly casting and portraying a king. When I watched Aragorn through the movies, there's no point at which he seems convincing as a king. But I can't think of the alternate actor who could have played the role and convinced me more as a king. So I don't think it's a fault of the performance per se. I think there's other issues there.
Do you know what the ironic thing is? I think Viggo Mortensen's portrayal of Aragorn devolves as the sort of series goes on. I believe in the first film, he is able to portray that conflict and nuance sufficiently to get across everything you need to know about this character, from the foreboding and mysterious Strider to the graceful and benevolent would-be king towards the end, which completes his arc. And I almost feel for the character that's enough. You almost don't need anything else. The portrayal of Aragorn is complete within the first film. And I can't help but get across that Theoden, and I forget the actor's name, unfortunately, but
Bernard Hill.
Bernard Hill. Bernard Hill's portrayal of Theoden is far more kingly than that
Yes,
of
I agree.
Aragorn as Elisar in the Battle of the Black Gate, almost to the point that I actually find it very unconvincing, his final speech, even though from a character point of view, that is supposed to be the ultimate culmination of his character and him at his superlative state of confidence. Instead, it seems rather jarring in contrast with what happened before.
Yeah, I don't think that he's nearly as strong there as Theoden is making his speech before the Battle of the Pelennor Fields.
Well, thank you. And just as we wrap up then, any final word from both of you on this topic? What were your concluding thoughts? Black Horse, you go first.
Read the book, forget the movie. No, the films are aesthetically very, very valuable. They're treasures. In that you would never get, you'll never get these aesthetics portrayed again in the foreseeable future, and so they are treasures and they should be held on to. On the other hand, I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of film as a format for storytelling, especially for grand myth. I think it's. I don't think there will ever be a film adaptation of The Lord of the Rings that makes me think that you should have created a film for The Lord of the Rings.
Now, I'm going to take the exact opposite approach, even though, interestingly enough, I think there's been quite a nice synergy between our viewpoints at this point. But I'm approaching it from a fundamentally different angle. Someone has very assiduously just said in the chat, the handicap of the third film was the pacing towards the denouement. I believe that the books have a problem with pacing in the first half of The Fellowship of the Ring, whereas the films have an issue with pacing towards the end. So ironically, I would definitely recommend you watch all the films, especially The Fellowship of the Ring, to bring you into this world and give you sufficient impetus to go ahead and read the books. And I would actually clash against this and say, I do believe, given the casting, given the aesthetics, given the care to all the production and design, the amount of time that was offered, the writing, how efficient all the character development is, how every scene is, even though I can joke about, say, for example, Helm's Deep and Pelennor Fields. And in particular, I almost hate almost all portrayal of battle, even historical and fantasy, because I'm always going to be taken out by how stupid some elements are. But putting that aside, I do believe that they are superlative adaptations and more than enough to bring you into the world of Tolkien. And I wouldn't hold anything against someone for wanting to come into the world and read the books, and not just read the 3 books, but read all the extended material as a result of these books. As a result of these films, I think they serve as a fantastic introduction, and they get across the characters, the aesthetic, and the themes sufficiently to bring you into this world and not debase it, as I would argue that almost any other adaptation that would have created. I mean, what's worse? What's worse, to have a terrible adaptation which would put everyone off reading the books than having a fantastic adaptation which would lend people more into this universe and bring out Tolkien? I think one of the reasons why the backlash to Rings of Power has been so, overwhelming,
Profound, yeah.
is because of the films and not because of the books.
Interestingly, the 9-year-old version of myself who first read The Lord of the Rings had trouble with the pacing in the first book. So your point is well taken. You know, I almost put it down in the Old Forest and never picked it up again. So there's a fair point to be made there.
Hopefully one day, though, in 30 years' time, when they decide to make the TV series that I'm pushing for, one per book, sorry, then we will finally get the forest, the old forest, and Tom Bombadil on the screen. That's what.
And
maybe
he will be a jolly old fellow. So
exactly.
No,
exactly.
I'm sure Tom Bombadil is going to be a wonderful non-binary black man. It's going to be wonderful. Yeah.
You may say that. I couldn't possibly comment. Have you
And
got
I'm sure,
anything?
I'm sure Tom Bombadil introducing the hobbits and song is going to be recontextualized as Tolkien anticipating drag queen story hour.
Yes, and Gandalf, Saruman of many colors, is going to take a new meanings as well.
Yes, Saruman is going to be the progressive hero of the story. And Tom Bombadil is going to be a drag queen. I can see it.
I'm going to have nightmares about this. Would you like to shill, guys?
No, I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me on, and I've had a blast. Thanks.
Black Horse?
There's nothing. Go and watch some of my work over on Lambda Bible Studies. Go and watch some of the work I've done with Rabla. Follow my Twitter so I can have more Twitter or followers to, I don't know, give me cred.
Get to the next 1,000. Up
There
to
you go.
2,000. That's the next aim. Well, I want to thank these two gentlemen. I've had a great time, and I feel like I've been pulled one way and then another, so I've come back to where I was at the very beginning, right between the two of you. But it's been good fun. For this channel, like and subscribe. It really helps to support it. On Saturday, if I have time, I'm planning to do a stream analyzing the themes of Gladiator, so a film just around this time, which I think has some parallels, but also some interesting boomer truth thrown in.
So long as you don't get me on to talk about the historical accuracy.
No, none of that's going to be taking place. Don't worry. I don't think that I could cope with that. It would be just too much to rip apart. Anyhow, thank you all. Thank you for your attention and for tuning in. And I hope you have a good rest of the evening, wherever you are. God bless you all. Goodbye.